All right, welcome to the next segment where we will look at keyframing some of the effects that we've generated. And to start with, we're going to keyframe our opacity on one of these layers. And so what I would like you to do is to select this top layer in the second video clip. And once we've selected that, let's go ahead and turn off any effects that happen to be still turned on other than opacity. And so right now there's none on this clip apparently. And there are several on the clip below it. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn off Find Edges, turn off Gaussian, and turn off Gaussian Blur. Right? So now I've got these two layers. One's 100% opacity, and the other one is 84% and set to screen. So let's change this back to normal, and let's change our opacity back to 100. And now the next thing I need to do is I need to select the upper clip, and this track, I currently have the visibility turned off, so I'm going to turn the visibility back on. Right? Because before we couldn't see it at all because in the last thing we had shut the visibility off on this layer. So I've got this layer set, and right now I can control the opacity across the entire clip all at once. But there's times when you might want a clip to fade in and fade out. You might want to manually make your own transitions by having opacity set to 0 and then at some later time set to 100%. And so to do that is reasonably simple. I need to show you a couple more ways you can interact with this first. So I'm setting my opacity to 100 here, and the blend mode is set to normal. What I'm going to show you first is something you can do on the timeline that opens up options that aren't immediately visible. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hover over in this gray area here. I'm going to hover over these lines. I'm going to click and drag down. And when I do that, you'll see that this first layer gets squished. All right, so I'm going to pull that back up a little bit. And then the layer or the video track that I want to work with is this V2. I'm going to stretch this up some. As soon as I do that, you'll see that I get a bigger preview of what's happening in the clip. It actually shows me little pictures all the way through so I know where I am and more or less what's happening at that moment in time. And there's also this line that's about 2/3 of the way to the top of this frame. This line, by default, is the opacity. And so you'll see if I hover over that for a little bit, some text pops up and it says opacity 100. This means that the opacity is at 100%. If I click and drag on this line, I can adjust the opacity for the clip here rather than doing it in that window. You'll notice if I peek up here a little bit, right, my opacity is now at 48 or 45.8%, right? So I can use this line as a way to roughly set the opacity of a clip. Now, this is also a place where I can create keyframes for the opacity. So I'm going to pull this back up to 100 and notice that 2/3 of the way up is 100%. And that's just so it doesn't overlap the file name here that's also listed. And so by default, opacity is what I can control here. And what I want to do is I want to keyframe that opacity. So to set keyframes, there's a couple ways you can do it. I prefer doing it down here rather than setting keyframes up here. You can click this to toggle the animation on, which turns keyframes on. And then you can actually set keyframes up here. But I find that to be pretty cumbersome when I'm working. So I prefer to set keyframes down here because I can see where I'm at in the clip and the interface seems to work a little bit better. So let's say at first we just want to fade this clip in on top of this other clip. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my playhead to the beginning of the clip. When I'm ready to set a keyframe, I need to use the pen tool. And the pen tool is available here. It looks like, own style pen tip. It's the same icon that Adobe uses for a lot of other programs. Now, when we start setting keyframes here, one of the issues with Premiere that I was just trying to figure out how to resolve if there was a setting I could set that I do not seem to find, is that it will set keyframes not always on a frame. It'll be off a little bit, and then when you go to set another keyframe value, you with your playhead, it ends up not aligning, and then really strange things happen. And I'll show you that here in a second. But let's start by dropping our first keyframe. So we're going to drop a keyframe here. And right now, this keyframe, if we adjust this value by clicking and dragging, it's still adjusting the opacity for the entire length of the video, because we don't have any other keyframe telling it when to do something else. And so one keyframe is basically the same as no keyframes. But if we go ahead and add a second keyframe somewhere a little bit further over, it doesn't really matter where, and then we click and drag on that first keyframe, we can pull this down so it's 0% here and it's 100% here. And then we can, as this heads over, it can slide through and slowly become more opaque. So once we've got these keyframes set, if I come over here and I try and put the playhead directly on top of this keyframe, I have trouble doing that. The other issue is that I need to probably zoom in significantly more in order to see if I'm on a frame exactly. And when you see this, you'll see, oh, like I'm actually offset, right? And this keyframe is actually still offset from that playhead. So if I bring it over a little bit, now it should be exactly on top of the frame. It's a little weird to me that it lets you to have your keyframes between frames. Most other pieces of software, and I don't even remember Premiere doing this in the past, but they force you to go, no, like it snaps to one keyframe or the other. And so once this is on, this point, then I can make an adjustment as is needed. But it's always good to make sure you are directly on a frame rather than in between, because when you go back to make adjustments, you might have some issues come up. Okay, so I've got this fading in, right? I can come over just a little bit further, create another keyframe, and pull this down and have that opacity very quickly drop, right? And again, we can create a couple more keyframes, and depending on how close together they are, we can either have, a smooth transition, or we could have a very quick pop where these guys just show up for, a handful of frames. All right, they're more like a flicker. And so these are the basics of setting keyframes. If I select a keyframe and I right-click on it, oops, there are a few options that I've got. I'm going to go ahead and do this not on that keyframe that I've got there. I'm going to pull this one out a little bit further, and I'm going to just select this lower one here. I'm going to zoom in just a bit more so we can see what's happening. So if I right-click on this, I get these options: linear, Bezier, auto Bezier, continuous Bezier, hold, ease in, ease out, and delete. So these are different ways that adjust the rate at which the video transitions, the transition happens between one keyframe and the next. So if I check mark this Bezier, what I get is a curve, and I get a couple handles. You may recognize this if you've ever used Photoshop or Illustrator or curves in Illustrator at all. But what this allows me to do is it allows me to adjust the shape of the line between the 2 points. And if I have a curve like this, that means it's going to stay opaque for longer and then very rapidly descend into to zero opacity. If I go the other direction with this, right, this is going to it's going to start by quickly dropping off in opacity and then become more gradual over time. So let's go ahead and look at what that looks like. Hopefully this is a long enough transition that we can see. So it comes up to full speed and then, okay, let me pull this one out further so we have some better sense of how this works. So, right, so you can see that, even here you can't see the video anymore, right? It flips very quickly. If I take this handle and make that curve go up, right, you can see that, and I make the curve, you can see if I do this, it's almost linear to whatever point I'm at between there. But if I make the curve, you know, somewhere in here, and I actually make my handle a little shorter there, right? Then when this goes, see my first keyframe's here, but they stay on screen for a lot longer, and then very quickly at the end, they become transparent. And so that's with Bezier. If I select that keyframe and I go back to linear, right, it'll snap back to that line we had before. If I right-click on it and say Auto Bezier, it'll make a little adjustment, and it basically, you know, changes those settings just a little bit. If I go to hold, however, a hold keyframe's a little bit different. What a hold keyframe does is it will hold, and this is not the right one, it will hold a value. So if I say, okay, I want to make this a hold keyframe, now you can see what's going to happen, right? So what it does is until this next keyframe comes up, it's basically 100%, and then it becomes 0%. So it's sort of like a switch on and off. And then ease in and ease out. If I say ease in, how about I just say linear and then ease in? Okay, so, I have to change, sorry, I'm forgetting to change one of the keyframes. There we go. So let's say linear, and I've done linear on both sides now. So if I right-click on this and say ease in, it's going to make a gentle curve there. If I change it and say ease out, it has to be ease out on this side. If I say ease out, right, it basically makes that so it's not linear, but it's just really gently curved, right? And there's a lot of times, especially with animating motion, where if you have just straight linear motion, that means that your object slides across the screen at a constant rate and then comes to a hard stop. Whereas if you ease in and ease out, it starts and then it picks up speed, it gets to its full speed, and then it slows down before it stops. And that feels a lot more natural. So we'll look at one of those examples here in a little bit when we keyframe some motion. All right, so opacity is our currently what we can keyframe. I'm going to pull all of these zeros up a little bit higher so that the clip is still visible throughout the entire length. It's just going to fade in and out a little bit as it goes through. And this is so we can see it, because we're going to go ahead and do some motion and keyframe some other things. So to keyframe motion, before I keyframe motion, I'm going to shrink this down. I'm going to use the scale option up here in my effect controls, and I'm going to make it about, 37% scaled. And what that's going to allow me to do is it's going to allow me to actually move this across the screen and be able to see it. And so if I want to keyframe motion and I want to do it on this graph here across this clip, what I need to do is I need to right-click on the clip, and I need to go down to the very bottom option, which is Show Clip Keyframes. And there's a few options here. There's opacity, which we're currently on, and there's motion. And it allows me to see my motion, my scale, uniform scale, rotation, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and do position. And this should be interesting. So I've got my position keyframes here. And what I want to do is I want to start setting keyframes. But, with position, I'm not moving in one dimension. I'm moving in 2 dimensions. And so to start with, I'm going to go ahead and just click on my position. So I have it selected. Oh, I have the wrong clip selected. There we go. I'm going to select position. And then I'm going to I'm going to toggle my animation on. Right? And when I toggle that animation on, my position, my object disappears a little bit, and I've created a keyframe. Right? And that keyframe is here on this first line. And now I'm just going to move my playhead over, and you can see there's my video. I'm going to move it over to about here. It doesn't really matter where. And you'll see that I've got this keyframe icon here, and I've got a keyframe icon here, and we'll talk about what those do in a second. And so now what I want to do is I want to set this next keyframe. And to do that, I could either click here to create a new keyframe, which is going to give it the same coordinates the old keyframe had. Or I could also just start manipulating one of these coordinates. And so let's say I want this to, go down and over into the corner. All right, so I've moved this to 501 and 378. And so now what's going to happen is, this thing's going to slide across the screen as I move through the video back and forth. And you'll see that I've got these two keyframes up here. Right? I also have on this timeline, if I zoom in, you'll see that I also have two keyframes. Right? My graph doesn't necessarily align with that, and you can't see X and Y. You only get a limited amount of information here. But what you are seeing is this line represents the rate of change. And right now that rate of change is constant. If I select both of these keyframes, if I select that one and then I hold down Shift and select this one, and if I right click and I say, I'll just do continuous Bezier, I don't know if that's actually going to change anything. Let me see what we get. There we go. But if hold on. Let me just do one keyframe. So if I select one of these keyframes and I right click and I go to ease in, because the direction of motion is this direction, right? And so it's easing into this keyframe. So if I click ease in, you'll see that instead of going in a straight line and having a hard stop, the rate of motion starts to taper and slow down. If I come to this keyframe and I click on it to select it, and I right click and go to ease out, right? Then the rate of motion starts slow, ramps up, and then ramps down, right? So this isn't showing me position on the screen, it's just showing me the rate of change for that motion. So I'm going to zoom back out a little bit. I'm going to pull this over, and I'm going to hit play. And you'll see it slows down, it speeds up, and then it slows down gently to come to a rest in that corner. And, currently my rate of speed is pretty slow. Something that I can do is if I zoom in a little bit here and click on this handle, right? I can adjust this rate of speed, right? I'm not going to be able to get it to go any faster than it currently is, because it's only going to go so fast across that amount of space because of where this second keyframe is. If I want this to go more quickly across the screen, what I need to do is I need to click on this keyframe and I need to drag this in. And you'll notice that the top of that curve is getting higher and higher, and it actually can, if I get close enough, it'll shoot outside of what's visible with how far I have this thing's done. And then what happens is once I release it, let me undo this again and show you. Once I release it, it's going to go back, it's going to rescale the height so it fits. Right? So I'm stretching it out and I let go. It looks like it's the same height as it was, meaning it would be the same speed, but actually it's changed. So if we go back to, if we go and zoom out again and we hit play, you'll see that that moved very, very quickly to that bottom corner. Right? And if I pull this out again, it'll move a little bit more slowly. All right, so that's keyframing motion. Scale works the same way, rotation works similarly, and so on and so forth. One thing, when you have a clip selected and you have keyframes on it, you'll also notice when I've changed the keyframe to ease in and ease out, it changes the shape of the keyframe. Right? A normal keyframe is a diamond. The ease in or ease out is this, I don't know what shape that is, something. If you do a hold keyframe, it's a cube or or this arrow that happens, right? And so, that just gives you a little bit of a visual cue. as far as what you're working with. You can zoom in on this as well so you can see more what you're doing. I do want you to notice that when I right-clicked on this, it does allow me to switch between temporal and spatial interpolation, but for the most part, temporal interpolation is what we want. That's basically saying over time, not so much over position or space. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at how we can keyframe one of the effects that we've already created on a different clip. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the visibility of this track off. So we're just working with this lower track. I'm going to select that track or that clip, and I am going to turn on Find Edges. We could do blur as well, but Find Edges is, really obvious when the change happens. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a place where I want, let's say that right where this scene starts, where it says man and his world, I want Find Edges to be turned off. And then I want to have that Find Edges be 100% a couple seconds later. Right? And so to do that, I have my effect turned on. And what I need to do is, rather than having, there's not like a however much, it's this blend, or there isn't like the opacity just has a 0 to 100%. Blend with original is the way that you keyframe most effects. Some effects have other settings you can keyframe, like this one, we can keyframe invert, right? So we could have the invert off and then do a hold keyframe and then flip it on like a switch. Whereas this one allows us to have more of a gradation between 100% and 0%. So I'm going to say 0% here, right? It's not, or sorry, I'm going to say it's blending 100% with the original. This means that the effect is not having any effect whatsoever. I'm going to turn keyframes on. And then that's dropped a keyframe here. If I want to be able to see the keyframe down here, I have to do two things. First, I have to pull this up so I can actually see this clip. Second, I need to right-click on here. I need to go down to Show Clip Keyframes. And now, for every effect that I have added to my clip, I now have menu options for those keyframes. And so I'm going to go to Blend with Original. And now I can see that keyframe that I just created on this timeline. And so now I could use my pen tool. I could come further over. I could create a second keyframe, and I can actually just click and drag to make that blend with original down to 0. And so now that effect of finding edges is slowly going to fill in until it's at 100%. Right? So I've got this set to 100%. And right, so this works exactly the same. And basically any setting, and let's go ahead and then create another keyframe here and another keyframe further over, pull this back up so that it fades back out to normal. Right? So this is the way that we can work with these effects and keyframe the different effects that we want to use. Okay. So any effect that we create, if it has one of these little, they're stopwatches is what these are supposed to be. I had no idea for a long time what those were when I was first using this. But so you can toggle these key animations on and off. One thing to note, if you turn this toggle off, it's going to delete all of these keyframes you set. It isn't like a visibility thing where it just makes it invisible for a bit and then makes it visible again. It actually gets rid of all of your keyframes. So if you want to turn the Find Edges effect off, you want to hit this FX thing because that is non-destructive, right? It turns it off temporarily and you don't see any changes. And then if you turn it back on, it'll automatically go back to where your keyframes are. So just be sure once you turn this on and start setting keyframes, you don't turn it off unless you intend to get rid of any keyframes that you created. So we could look at another effect right? Gaussian blur. So Gaussian blur actually has 3 keyframeable options. It has blurriness, blur dimensions, and then the repeat edge pixels. So let's make it reasonably blurry right now. We're not going to keyframe this. I'm just going to set blurriness to 75. And instead of doing horizontal, I'm going to say, oh no, let's just leave it at horizontal for now. And then what I want to do is I want to start keyframing this part of the effect, right? This blurriness. And so I'm going to go somewhere where I can actually see everything. So right about here, I'm going to start keyframing blur dimensions. Now, with this, right, it's created this keyframe here. And remember, if I want to be able to use those keyframes or set them on the timeline, I need to right-click. I need to go down to Show Clip Keyframes. I need to go to Gaussian Blur and Blur Dimensions, right? And so now I've got this keyframe set here. So let's go ahead and pull this down a little further. I'm going to add a keyframe. And on that keyframe, while I still have my playhead over the keyframe that I just set, and actually what I should probably do is set the keyframe here, or just change the setting, and I want to make this vertical. And when I do that, right, rather than slowly transitioning between horizontal and vertical, what it does is it acts like a hold keyframe, right? So it's horizontal, 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 vertical, right? And so that's something just to note, is that the vertical and horizontal options, anything where you select something or turn something on and off, it automatically treats those keyframes as hold keyframes. You don't need to especially set them. Right? So this gives you a lot of control over how to set effects and things in Adobe Premiere. For the next section, we are going to look at, we'll look at speeding up, slowing down clips, and we'll also look at what a matte is, which is essentially a mask if you've used Photoshop or Illustrator. Okay, stay tuned.